What was shocking is after the book was published, we had close friends and neighbors that had no idea what the family was going through.
Welcome to DNA Clarity and Support. I'm your host, Brian. Listen as I chat with authors and leaders in the DNA world about the family and personal impacts of DNA testing. You'll hear news stories, unique perspectives, find out about books, websites, organizations, other podcasts for those involved in the world of DNA. Please be sensitive to younger listeners as the conversations can get intense at times. This is a production of Watershed DNA. Learn more at watersheddna.com. Today's podcast guest is Laura Kieger. Laura is the author of Summer's Complaint, My Family's Courageous Century-Long Struggle with a Rare Genetic Cancer Syndrome. And I'm excited to have Laura here to talk with us about her book, which is based on her family's experience. I want more people to know about your book, so I'm excited to help make that happen.
Well, and I appreciate that because I'm excited to get the word out about genetic cancer syndromes. Mm-hmm. I mean, what was shocking is after the book was published, we had close friends and neighbors that had no idea what the family was going through. They were like shocked. They were like, I had no idea, Laura, what was going on because your family was so normal and you guys were so fun. And yeah, we knew there were other problems. We were a big family, money could be tight, that kind of thing, but no one had any idea, what we were. I mean, how many people haul their kids off for colonoscopies when they're 14?
Right.
Really?
Right. Right. And that's not like something you're going to go to school and like talk to your friends about, like getting your colonoscopy. So it's just, I understand why it was like just something that you talked about within the family.
And we could even joke about it within the family, but outside of that, my friends would know I was leaving school for a doctor's appointment. I didn't necessarily have to spend a lot of time going into details what I was going for. And, at that point, it was just an annual thing. So, we just fit it in our schedules. It just became part of what we do and what we did.
I'm also thinking about how many people in the FAP community will listen to it and realize that they're not alone. Maybe their family also was going through all of this quietly, and just how your story is going to help other families who have been dealing with FAP for decades. Can you tell us about your background and how you came to write Summer's Complaint?
Well, I always loved writing as a kid. I was just one of those kids that was constantly, putting poems together or limericks or little silly short stories. So along with liking to write and finding it actually very therapeutic sometimes, I also paid attention to my family and their stories. And I just sort of absorbed all of it. And one of my sisters said, Laura, of all the 8 kids, you're the one to write the book. Because they saw me, I was always, writing, reading, interested in the stories that they were telling. In fact, I think I even wrote poems for each of my siblings. That was a lot of fun. But my husband and I, as we raised our children, I found myself working. I was a busy HR consultant in healthcare. And it took me some time, but I reached a point where I thought it's really time for me to write this book.
So you're the family's historian, really, and your book centers around your family's experience with a hereditary condition called FAP, familial adenomatous polyposis. I know that's a mouthful, so we'll call it FAP for short. And although that's considered a rare disease, it's one that affects many, many families around the world. Can you give us a short summary of what you think everyone should know about FAP?
What I would like people to know about FAP is something that was profoundly important to me and to my family, is that even if you are diagnosed with the gene mutation that causes FAP and you're in the same family, it can express differently.
Meaning not everybody who carries that genetic predisposition might show symptoms at the same age, or might get diagnosed at the same age, or might need treatment at the same age.
Exactly. The common, sort of thread in all this is I think my siblings kind of looked out for each other. We asked each other how we were doing, how did their exams go, and we assume that we would experience this disorder similarly. And we watched our mother and we heard her stories, and she would say, don't worry about this, or this is what you need to watch out for in terms of symptoms or questions to ask the doctor. But unfortunately, we found out that it doesn't express the same way. And so as an example, I would put out my two eldest sisters who have lived a very long life with this disorder. They outlived their mother. But tragically, both of them lost children to this disease. So on one hand, I can celebrate, their long lives and very full lives, but there's been tragedy along with it. And yet they all shared the same genetic mutation.
So it's a dominant condition, which for people who are not familiar with, dominant versus recessive genetic conditions, a dominant condition is something that a parent carries a variant in a gene, and it only takes one copy of that gene having a genetic variant in it for the disease to occur. And so when that parent is having children, each child has a 50% chance of inheriting that version of the gene from their parent. So it's not something that we see skip generations like we might for some other conditions. So FAP is a dominant condition. There was a scene that you wrote about in your book where you were in college in a biology lecture, I think it was, and the professor was talking about dominant genetic condition. This was the first time you realized that it was describing what was happening in your family with the genetic disease. And you went home from that lecture and you talked to your mom about it and wrote about that scene in the book. Do you want to talk a little bit about, that realization in college of what your family was facing and how you talked about that with your mother?
So we knew we had familial polyposis or FAP, prior to my entering college. But it was this course called Hereditary and Human Society. And I took it because it sounded interesting and it didn't have a lab, which I was thrilled. So it's like, great, I can get some science credits and not have to actually go in a lab and do things. So I was hanging out with some friends in the very back row of the lecture hall because that was the place you could talk and goof off. And we went into fruit flies and Gregor Mendel, and we started covering recessive disorders, genetic disorders. And then he started talking about dominant genetic conditions. And he put up what I would call a pedigree chart with X's and O's on it. And it showed the one parent that carried the gene mutation and how it cascaded down. And I literally at that moment in my mind saw my mother's name and my siblings' names in those squares and circles.
It just looks so familiar to you.
It looked so familiar, but what I did is I took what was happening in real life, and all of a sudden it became so much more real that scientists were studying it. And this was like a big deal. And it was like being just struck by lightning. At that point, I realized this is like something that's serious. And I thought, does my mother know about this? Well, of course. Which is a silly thought. But my mother had, she got married when she was still in high school, and she never had the opportunity to take a hereditary and human society class. So I went home. I was like loaded for bear, you know what I mean? And she was doing the dishes. I can still see it like it happened yesterday. And I said to her, Mom, do you know that you, as an only child, passed down a hereditary cancer syndrome, something to like your kids and potentially your grandkids? And then I started explaining to her in my way, not very non-scientific way, what I saw on the pedigree chart. And I could tell she really felt it. She really felt that sting. And of course, I was just kind of snarky and flippant and really didn't think of the words I was using and how that could hurt her.
Because at the time, I'm for sure she had been thinking about, her role in that condition passing down through the family. And I imagine it was really emotional for her and probably some aspects of guilt. But it's not like that's not where your mind was at that point. It was more the discovery that researchers are studying this, and this isn't something we've talked about as a family yet.
Yeah, exactly. And it was the first time where I questioned if it had been a good idea to have 8 kids. And, I'm questioning myself existing on the planet at that point because, we were all still being monitored for potentially having the condition because there wasn't a genetic test at that point. So it was all done on clinical diagnosis. So it was a hard conversation and she forgave me. But to this day, that interaction with my mother still bothers me.
You still think back on that conversation?
I think back on it. And I've had, my own children, they've been teenagers and they've been flip about things and, maybe said some things about, pointing out my choices or their dad's choices. And, that's part of life. That's what gets you talking as a family. So,
yeah. That's a hard thing about being a parent is you can't go back and redo decisions that you made in the past. You just have to learn from them and change things moving forward.
Right. Absolutely.
Now, you came from a very large family. You and your siblings totaled 8 of you. And so how has your perspective on your mother and her life and decisions, how has that evolved over time? And specifically, if you think about the course of writing this book about her life and your families, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
So my mom was a very busy homemaker, wife, mother. She also picked up hobbies. That's hard to believe with, everything she had going on. She liked to sew. She liked cake decorating. And what the funniest story or the funniest part about my mother was, she seemed to handle every crisis that came her way just fluidly, like just another day in the life of having 8 children and 2 dogs and a cat and a chameleon and a couple of birds. And, she just handled it effortlessly. She was never on the phone calling my dad, hey, send a message to your father. I need him to come home. The electricity's out. She handled all that stuff on her own. Plumbing, the circuit breakers, fixing the lawnmower. The woman was amazing. And I keep thinking to myself, that's because she grew up on a farm. She grew up on a farm and that's just what she did.
She learned to be independent and just to take things as they came.
She did that. But one thing I did notice about my mother, and I sort of resolved it emotionally myself writing the book, is there was something about her that was, I'm not going to say it was sad, but she did have a sense of loneliness, I think, as a child, because her mother died when she was 6. And then her dad moved out to California with his new wife. And she was raised by an aunt and uncle, but she missed her cousins up in North Dakota. She didn't have any siblings. She just was, I think was lonely as a child. And then when she met my dad, it was like Shazam. And I think she honestly loved having all those kids and loved having a big family because she had her tribe, her thing, these people around her that loved her and she loved dearly. And I think it kind of made up for some of her loneliness as a child. The other thing is my mom liked to put things on a refrigerator. And one of them was the Serenity Prayer about, what you can control, what you can't, and the wisdom to know the difference. And of course, I'd look at it and think, well, whatever. I mean, whatever that means, because I was a kid. I was usually looking for the thermometer chart on wind chills so I would know how to dress for the bus stop in the morning.
Because you were a Minnesota family,
Minnesota,
right? Yeah, reading the description of how you had to plan your winter, your outside wear based on not just the temperature, but the wind chill factor. That was just fascinating.
It could freeze the flesh on your face. Anyway, yeah, that's what my dad would say. But that Serenity Prayer, honestly, after she passed away, I made sure that I took it off the refrigerator and I brought it to my own refrigerator. So as I had children, and when we go through all those machinations of life, I found that she'd really lived that. She knew what she could control, what she couldn't, and the wisdom to know the difference. And I think that was a really good perspective for her.
Sounds like her wisdom and what you learned from your mother is something that you still carry with you today, even though she's no longer here.
I do try hard to be more like her that way. My parents, I've told my husband, my parents had enough real problems. They certainly didn't need imaginary ones.
What would be an imaginary problem?
That you forgot you left your dry cleaning at the dry cleaners, or you didn't have a
problem that's not really a problem.
Exactly. Or you didn't have the ground meat you needed to make sloppy joes, and that's what the kids wanted. Mm-hmm. But I am more of a fighter. I am more of a try to figure it out and avoid, bad things sort of coming your way. So read or talk or figure it out. But she just kind of she'd go with the flow. And it's amazing what didn't rattle her. So I actually, at one point, I didn't quite figure her out because I was very different from my mother personality-wise. But as I had my own children, I started to see, how brilliant she actually was. It was like, because she had a lot to worry about. And it did bother her, knowing that she carried that gene mutation and she had passed it down. She didn't talk about it, but we could just see it in her face and in her eyes when she'd hear of a bad report coming from, the GI doc or whichever grandchildren. It really bothered her hearing when the grandchildren were diagnosed with it. Mm-hmm. And so I have a much greater appreciation, not only for who she was as a person, but my parents' marriage and how their commitment was really what helped build resiliency in the family. And, I appreciate that more now. So in writing the book, helped illuminate that for me.
That's great. And while you were pretty certain based on the lack of symptoms as you grew up of having FAP, and you're pretty sure you weren't a carrier, when the genetic test became available to you that would give you that conclusive answer about it, you decided to do it. And getting a negative test result, meaning you were shown to not have the family variant, you wrote about how that made you question your life and what you were doing with it. And I think most people assume that only if you get a positive result would that really have any impact on those big existential questions of who am I and what I'm doing with my life. But regardless of whether the test was positive or negative, that happened to you. What do you want people to know about genetic counseling and the role of that in your family, and why that type of support might be important for somebody who's getting a genetic test, regardless of the final outcome of it?
So our Dr. Schultz, our family colorectal surgeon that had kept an eye on us kids for over 30 years, actually, even well into adulthood, and when we started having our families, he had mentioned that there was a genetic test. And I thought, he has told me all these years I probably don't have it because whenever I went in for my exams, I didn't have the polyps. And I just thought, I'm going to go in and it makes sense to go in and have the test done. But that was around 1998, 1999. And it wasn't as good as the tests are today. They've changed and they've improved over time. And it might have seemed sort of like it was after the fact decision because I'd had my 3 kids and I basically wasn't worrying about it because I felt confident enough that I didn't have the gene mutation. But I wanted to go in and have the test. And this was the first time that I'd had the opportunity to speak to a genetic counselor. So her name was Mary, and I spoke with her before the test, the blood draw, and I spoke with her when I got the test results. And I had never experienced having someone in a room with me just privately discussing things that had been on my mind for so long and that I really didn't feel I could talk to my siblings about, and not necessarily my mother, because it was things like, why did some of my siblings get this mutation and not me? How can I be helpful to them when they see me? We saw it as sort of a get out of jail free card, but that we didn't feel that way ever. We felt like this was a common enemy. Mm-hmm. And so Mary sat with me and we talked through all those sort of heavy topics.
Yeah.
And it was almost like she could read my face, and she'd ask a question. It would be like, oh yeah, that reminds me. That's something that I've always wanted to talk to somebody about. And I could even talk with her about my mother's decision as an only child to have 8 kids. She could explain those things to me because I didn't have a genetics background. So when the test came back, I felt pretty confident that I didn't have the APC gene mutation that causes FAP. And at the time, I was approaching 40. And I just wanted to make sure that, I was using my time well. And I kind of developed this philosophy of more experiences, less stuff. And I almost immediately I talked to my husband and said, let's start traveling with the kids. Let's give them experiences that are important, like road trips and seeing the country. And of course, back to my test result, my husband was relieved with that. But I just thought our time is our life, and every single day that you are given to be able to wake up, to be able to breathe is a gift. And so, yeah, even though I got good news, I wanted to be grateful for that good news. So,
it can be life-changing to have a DNA test. And that's where watershed DNA came from, is this idea that some moments in life are like a watershed moment where everything that comes after is so different than it was before. And sometimes a DNA test can be that for somebody. I'm glad that Mary was there and that you had a chance to speak with a genetic counselor. I think a lot of people who haven't met with a genetic counselor don't really understand what a session with a genetic counselor is like. And maybe there's a preconception that genetic counselors are just science teachers and they'll talk to you about recessive versus dominant. And although there's an aspect of the training that genetic counselors have that is really solidly based in understanding the medical genetics science, there's a huge portion of our training as genetic counselors that is the human aspect and the family impacts and the need to be able to understand the emotional impact and talk about that. And I'm really glad that your interaction with Mary helped you be able to talk about things that you hadn't ever been able to talk about with anyone in your family or anyone else before. That makes it so much more important to support access to genetic counselors for other people like you and other families like yours.
Absolutely. I talked to her about things I didn't even feel comfortable talking with Dr. Schultz about. And he'd been in our lives for years and years and years and years. It was just a different kind of counseling where some of those angsts and concerns I had kind of buried and just not wanted to come out, I was in a very comfortable and protective space with her.
Yeah. Sometimes a meeting with a genetic counselor is just a one-time thing and it's very focused. It's focused on whatever is the issue at hand. In other situations, you might meet with the genetic counselor a couple of times. So before you have the genetic test, when the results come back, and then at some point again, or multiple times again in the future. And for your family, because you were followed in the same clinic over decades and decades of life, did other people in your family have the opportunity to speak with Mary or another genetic counselor?
Well, once the genetic test became available, I was assuming my siblings were having those discussions also, because that would have been in the mid to late 1990s. But if we talk about our generation versus the next generation, our children and our grandchildren, that's where I could really see the changes in the emphasis on genetic counseling more than my generation and my siblings and I had. And I know that my nieces and nephews had gone to genetic counselors as part of their treatment plan, they're part of their care plan, multiple times. This wasn't just once or twice, because as they're getting older, they've got different questions. And now they're dating, and now they want to get married, and all of those, really heavy, monumental life moments, that you're thinking about. It was another person that they could talk to, especially if they had the FAP gene mutation. So
And an aspect of that that's different now than in past generations is the emergence of technologies where we're able to test an embryo prior to an IVF treatment for a genetic condition that might be hereditary in some families. And so some genetic counselors specialize in talking with families that have a known genetic variant that could be tested and prevented from future generations from having. So that's not something that was available in the time that your mother was having children or you were having your children, and it is now. So I think that makes sense that it's a very different, as medical science has progressed, it's changing the way that families with FAP are able to use the information from the genetic test itself.
I did have a niece that decided to go with that there's a name for it.
Pre-implantation genetic testing.
Yes.
Or screening.
Screening. Yep. And so she was the first in the family to look into that. And so that was something really new to us.
Yeah.
So I was glad that the technology was there. I was glad that the counseling was there for her because it was, she was married to a gentleman who might think that was playing around with nature or God or however you want to, describe that. So they needed to have that counseling, definitely.
Yeah, because there's that level of consideration about, what is something that as a couple, they might find. Not every family and not every person within a couple who's making a decision around childbearing might have the same feelings about what's acceptable to test for and what's really not within the parents' realm of making a decision. So I can see that being able to have a genetic counseling session where these difficult discussions are out on the table and the couple can work through, maybe if they're not on the same page, how to get on the same page.
I'd almost call them crucial conversations. These are crucial
conversations. Is that what you said? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is a crucial conversation. And it's one thing if you didn't know that your family was at risk for any genetic condition, but if you do know that there's a risk, it changes things.
It does.
Your son, Alex, did research as part of a team, and you were shocked when you attended his presentation to find out that he was working on the topic of cancer predisposition. And prior to that, you hadn't really had an awareness of what he was working on. What was that like, and what conversations have you had with Alex in the time since he was a student working in that area?
Well, we didn't know, of course, what the topic of his presentation was. And so we were very surprised and proud of him, his dad and I. And we went down to Iowa City for a weekend. And the students, the undergrad science students, were giving their presentations. And I knew my parents would be really proud of him. I mean, my dad died fairly young and, he loved science, but he didn't have an education beyond high school, and he would have loved that. So I just remember thinking how proud my parents would be of him. And he's been really heavily influenced by growing up in this family. And it probably was a major contributor to his decision to go to medical school. But along the way, he seemed to have a knack for math and science, and he seemed to like it. He seemed to enjoy those subjects. Very opposite of me back in 79 when I'm looking for a class that doesn't have a lab, right? He'd be right in there and say, yay, I got a lab associated with it. But he's been really good when he went through med school. And then as a resident, he was really good as a kind of a peer coach to his cousins. And he knows how to coach being at the level he was at the time. So, he hadn't completed his training yet. But he was always encouraging them to go in for their annual scoping. And also did they like their doctors? Were they comfortable with their doctors? He would look things up for them. Oh, you're going to Cleveland Clinic or you're going to MD Anderson. These are some of the people that are considered the experts in our family's disease. And so he was really good about that, but always concerned for the family. And one time he called me and I was sitting in my car. I was about to go walk in somewhere. And he said, Mom, they're talking about FAP in grand rounds today. And I'm like, really?
He was very excited. Yeah, because he was excited about that because that's what your family has been dealing with for decades.
Yes. It was kind of his moment, like mine I had watching the big pedigree chart on the giant screen in 1979, but he's actually studying this stuff. And so he automatically went into taking care of his mom mode. He said, Mom, so you're not jumping around looking at different doctors. You got to stick with the same people, stick with the team you trust, make sure that they're well-versed in the disease. And so it was really adorable. So he was just kind of looking out for me. But yeah, that came up when they were talking about FAP as when he was a med student.
You described spending some time on the computer in your basement and making a discovery that the colon cancer syndrome was more than just colon cancer. And it explained all of the other rare cancers and issues that had affected generations of your family, starting from very young, like your nephew, Marky, and continued up for family members in young adulthood and midlife, and then later in adulthood. Do you have a selection of the book that you had pulled out? Okay, so great. Could you read a little bit of a section of your book for us to talk about that experience?
So I was in the basement, I was doing research, and I started to type in, that was Internet Explorer days, and I started to type in family's disease and FAP, familial adenomatous polyposis, Turcotte syndrome. I was just, obsessed. And because I was in a pretty dark place with what we had been hearing coming from the family and what they were going through and what they were being diagnosed with. And so what I wanted to read was this passage. Suddenly, the days of visits to Dr. Schultz were the good old days. Days when our primary concern was the potential of a future colostomy. We kind of grew up thinking, the worst thing that can happen to us is we have to have our colons removed and we have a colostomy bag or an ileostomy bag. And all of a sudden, that whole mental mindset, mental paradigm just shifted. And I missed his straight talk and connection to our family. We'd had no idea just how bad this mutation really was. It was as if the annoying pain in the ass cousin you'd learned to live with had become a ruthless tormentor, silently targeting those you love. Then the panic started to set in. My fear was that our inherited polyposis wasn't just a colorectal syndrome, cancer syndrome, but a precancerous state that would require even more vigilance on our part. I'm going to put the book down. Even though I was told I didn't carry the gene mutation, I carried heavy burden to help my family. Mm-hmm. And I felt at that time I had let them down. I had let go and I hadn't been paying attention like I should have been. And that's such a weird thing. I mean, even my siblings will say, Laura, why were you trying so hard to stay on top of FAP? That's our job. We have the disease, that's our doctor's job. But there was something, our parents were gone. Dr. Schultz was retiring. He had retired, actually. And a lot of my siblings had moved and they were scattered all around the country. Mm. And suddenly it's that control thing, that serenity prayer about control what you can and you can't. And we hadn't even been talking about it. And so I had learned through just different discussions. And I'm going to give you some examples. My two oldest sisters had been put on every 6-month colonoscopy, upper GI scopes, endoscopy, colonoscopy every 6 months. And that was a big change from when we were growing up. But I had brothers who were still on the annual colonoscopy, maybe an upper GI, and one who was thinking he only had to get an upper GI every 3 years. And they were going to different doctors at this time in different cities. And it just frustrated me because I thought there should be a standard of care. Why are some of my siblings getting different advice on their surveillance than others?
Yeah.
And I started to panic. I literally started to panic, thinking this thing we are losing our knowledge and we're not talking anymore. We don't have the same doctor anymore. And so it was really that moment where I thought, I have to do more. I'm not going to let this thing take my family out the way that and at that feeling at that time, that's just exactly how it felt. And so all of that research I did, all of those papers I printed out, and I'm not kidding you, there was a lot of paper, that eventually became Summer's complaint. So I had saved all those papers and all that research, and I even have the date stamp. Remember the old days when you'd print off paper and they'd have to give you a date stamp in the lower left-hand corner?
Yeah.
So I know exactly what nights I was down in that basement, throwing papers and wine glasses against the wall, if you know what I mean. And so that, and then along with my family documents, birth certificates, death certificates, medical records, letters that had gone between my mother and her family in North Dakota, that really was the foundation for Summer's complaint. And I hadn't decided to write the book at that moment because I was in survival mode at that moment and my family was in survival mode at that moment. But when I finally found the time to step back a bit from my busy career and my kids were older, I thought, this is the time. I can do it now. And so that was how I became an advocate and what went into the decision to write Summer's complaint.
Wow. So it sounds like through all of the grief, because you've lost family members. And there was a point in the book where you were grieving, you're talking about grieving the death of your brother and your niece, and those had happened within months of each other, just like boom, boom. And you wrote to your sister, Debbie, I have to believe that there's some deeper meaning to all of this, or I would have trouble seeing the light again. I see your book, Summer's Complaint, as something that has come out from your grief and your grieving process at a time that was right for you and for your family. And I think of all of the people who are going to read it in the future and learn from it. I hope that medical professionals will read it and learn from it. There's so much good that can come out of the pain you went through to get your book out there. So how are you feeling now compared to when you were first writing that to Debbie, when you didn't see the light again?
Well, I've started to look for all of the little signs that told me that we were going to get through this and that things would get better. I wanted to believe that. And I would say that I still have some of those, moments about, I can't see the light. But over time, we just gathered as a family and we took care of ourselves. I was trying to think through that concept of when you retreat and how that looks to outsiders, but we were hurting so much because of the back-to-back diagnosis that we had in two young family members that we had to just kind of take care of ourselves. And so to our friends and family, I'm sure we looked broken. We felt broken. And honestly, it was hard being happy. So little things like going to birthday parties or going to a wedding, they became painful. They became work. But over time, we started to see good things happening. The grandchildren becoming parents. Things had changed in the world of gastrointestinal cancer surveillance. And we made sure that we saw we went to, institutions like academic medical centers that had teams there for us, including genetic counselors. So it just took a couple of years to just kind of work our way out of it. But from the outside, this was a very typically how I would describe my family is we're very gregarious. We have a lot of extroverts. It's a lot of love. And people had trouble watching us go through it. We didn't even want to talk about it. It was awful. And so, over time, we had to start looking for the things to be grateful for. and keep up with that life, that thought that every day that we can get up and we can breathe. And as my brother would say, put our pants one pant leg on at a time and just keeping it in perspective. But, that was a tough time.
Now, you've mentioned that you have an online group of other FAP families that you're a part of. And what other resources do you recommend for other families or individuals like you to help advocate?
Well, there was the part of me that was doing a lot of research years ago. And then, of course, with social media, there's just been an explosion of options and in different groups and people that people can connect with. But one that helped me quite a bit was NORD, the National Organization for Rare Disorders. They speak in plain English, and I think they're very helpful for people with rare disease. A lot of them are genetic, not necessarily genetic, but a lot of them, are genetic related. And since FAP is considered a rare disease, I found that organization very helpful. And any of the public websites like the NIH, National Cancer Center, I find very helpful when I'm looking for information. I'm fortunate in that I come from a family that's pretty well connected in the healthcare space. So we were more fortunate than some people to be able to access experts through the connections that we had made over the years. And I've worked in healthcare myself. And I have several family members that have worked in healthcare. Also, I found Gene Reviews. Are you familiar with that?
I am. Yeah. I'm glad that you mentioned both NORD and Gene Reviews. I will put links to those sites in the show notes. Excellent resources for rare diseases, because individually rare diseases are not common, but as a group, they're extremely common.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of people that have a rare disease in their family.
So those were the ones that really jumped out at me in terms of being helpful. And I do want to say with COVID and being isolated, I felt very deeply for the individuals that couldn't get in for their annual exams, whether they be a Lynch syndrome family member or patient or FAP or BRCA. All of those inherited cancer syndromes require these annual exams and having access to physicians. And so when we were isolated and we were having our exams pushed out. That's what I did notice on my FAP Facebook group, was they were verifying for me my fear that people weren't going to be able to get in and have their exams on time. And this is not an elective thing.
You have to stay on top of it.
They have to stay on top of it, because if you're going to get a cancer up near your paraambulary area or in your stomach or somewhere in your GI tract, in my family, you need to be able to you have to catch it early.
So that's a good point to make now for anyone listening who needs to get back on their routine schedule for their screenings. Don't wait. Call today. Get back on it.
Yes, very important. So that also was part of my advocacy is, what can I do? How can I help people not start panicking and saying, you've got to push, you've got to push. You have to say this isn't an elective. This is part of something that I have to do, and get every resource at your disposal to make sure that you get in and get that endoscopy, because they're important.
Well, I consider your book a resource now for FAP families in particular. So someone who is listening today, where can they go to find a copy of Summer's Complaint?
Well, I think most people go out to Amazon. The book is out there. There are reviews out there. And also IndieBound. I've had a few people purchase a book through IndieBound. I had not been aware of IndieBound until I had someone contact me and say, hey, here's where I got the book. And, hi. And then she actually went out on Goodreads to leave me a review. So, with the pandemic, it's been difficult. I usually attend author events, and those have been either gone virtually or they're just non-existent. So I'm hoping, as things start loosening up and we get through a lot of this, that I can start traveling and talking to people. I do have a lot of people with similar syndromes come up to me and want to talk to me about the book. And they talk about me about growing up in a family with an inherited cancer syndrome. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that. Actually, I missed it. I missed it. I miss seeing people and talking with people.
Well, I'm grateful for you having written the book. I'm grateful for having come on the podcast today so that more listeners can learn about it. And I wish you the very best at all of your advocacy work. It's making a difference. Keep going with it. And thank you.
Thank you, Brian, and thanks for inviting me today.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of DNA Clarity and Support podcast. Head on over to watersheddna.com to learn more about the resources and support available for those involved in DNA discoveries.